Right, you probably try to buy sustainable products, but I personally find that so hard to do. Right, because the scale of food products is just wild. There are hundreds of thousands of products that we can choose from. And when we think about fisheries, it's equally, it is equally large. As Holly mentioned, aquaculture is incredibly diverse. We have 582 aquaculture species, a really diverse industry. And then when we turn to fisheries, it's equally massive. The FAO reported that there are over 2,000 wild-caught species being sold at market that countries are reporting. So how do we tell the difference between all these different species when we're buying? And then on top of that, how do we ensure that we're buying something that's meeting certain environmental or social objectives? It's incredibly difficult. So this isn't even counting livestock or different terrestrial systems, right? That's equally huge. Then there's equilibrium. So equilibrium came in to try to put us at ease, to make us be that one laughing over the salad. I've always wondered what she's laughing about, and it turns out she's just the sheer joy of sustainable products. Right, but actually equilibrium is a mixed bag. It has some pros and cons. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But what it aims to do is it puts a blue or green sticker on a product, and that's supposed to ensure that environmental or social needs are being met. They usually have a social component, even if they're skewed towards environmental things. There's a series of standards that different members throughout the supply chain are supposed to adhere to, and then they get certified. And supposedly, producers can benefit from streamlined and more efficient production and better market access. So at World Wildlife Fund, the message to farmers or different producers was that you're not necessarily going to get a price premium, but you're going to have an easier relationship with different members throughout your supply chain. You're going to have an easier relationship selling your product through time to different retailers. Right, so fair trade was developed in 1998, and to my knowledge, this is one of the bigger eco-labels that we started with. It's pretty recognizable. And then there's also USDA Organic, so eco-labels can come from NGOs, and they can come from governments as well. And then there's a couple other ones you might recognize, like FSC, maybe you've seen that on paper products. And then for seafood, MSC, that's probably familiar to a lot of us in the room, but that's for wild caught. So for aquaculture, we have Aquaculture Stewardship Council and a number of others, which I'll get to in a minute. But ASC, by a lot of people, is considered to be the most environmentally rigorous set of standards out there. And that's not just because I'm biased, which coming from World Wildlife Fund, WWF, and the Dutch Sustainable Trade Initiative came together over 10 years ago to form ASC and a set of standards. So ASC is a little special in that it came out of a stakeholder-driven process that was developed over years of scientists, NGOs, farmers, associations coming together to decide what does the best version of farming look like within a certain aquaculture sector. And it's gaining traction. Just since around 2012 when they started certifying farms, there's over 620 farms that are certified, over 68 countries, and around 6 species groups. 41% of those farms happen to be shrimp farms. So that's the most popular right now. So you can see that it's been growing, but I wager that, so ASC, to my knowledge, the goal is to certify around 5% of the industry and then hopefully move the rest of the industry along with it. But I think that it has a very small market share. So one set of data that we're not provided is the amount of production that's coming out of these farms that are being certified. But I still imagine it's quite small compared to the 110,000 tons that the FAO reported last year for aquaculture as a whole. But ASC, as I mentioned, is not alone. There is best aquaculture practices. This is from an industry group called Global Aquaculture Alliance. Fair Trade is working on a set of standards as well. And then there's Friend of the Sea, who I don't know much about. But there are a number of different groups who will put a label on something to try to tell you that they have met certain environmental standards. But do we know those environmental standards? Are we familiar with them as consumers? Probably not. Oh, and then I forgot to mention that since this space is so competitive, there are so many different eco-labels trying to stake a claim in the American market. Some groups instead have said, you know what an eco-label is about? It's about a brand. It's about people recognizing certain product or a certain level of trust. So some retailers have decided instead, we are the brand. We can develop the standards. So Whole Foods, which Doug knows, has developed a set of standards that every farm who wants to sell to them has to adhere to. I don't know how their standards were developed. I don't know if they were scientifically rigorous, but I do know they're happening, and I do know that this is the 4th largest food retailer in the country, so they're having probably one of the largest impacts in the US. Right, so now that we know that this is a really competitive space and that there are some pros and cons, is it moving the aquaculture industry forward? So there are a few issues. There are a number of standards, and they're meant to fit farms across the world that really vary. So some of these standards make sense in certain contexts, and then some of them don't. Some of them are vague, but then some of them are measurable. So it so happens that it can be pretty hard to come back in and measure the progress of a farm over time to see if they really are improving or not. It's hard to see if these certification schemes are really having an impact. And then because some of these were developed through stakeholder-driven processes, they can be really hard to update, because how do you gather those stakeholders again and again and again? And then we're all tired of seeing all these eco-labels, or some of us are. I personally am like a little overwhelmed because I just don't know what they mean. But there are some benefits to certification, and the one I'm, again, most familiar with is ASC. So they were developed in a really rigorous process, and I do think that's pretty cool. And while Whole Foods developed their own set of standards, some other retailers have said, hey, it's really cool that y'all have developed such a rigorous set of standards. We would like to adopt them. We're just not going to use your label. So Costco actually has a number of ASC products in its stores. You just won't see the label. And then in some cases, not all, I've seen better farming practices. So I've seen communities come together and manage their farms together as an ecosystem. And they helped, ASC helped build them, it helped create an infrastructure for them, which was really neat. So what are we to do with complex information? I think that it's too much to ask consumers to recognize all these different labels. Instead, I think we might turn to brands like Salty Girl, or retailers, like we can ask Trader Joe's to be a little more transparent. And then I think we can shorten our supply chain. So when we buy or ask for local aquaculture products, we might have a better idea of what we're getting, and we'll know where and what to ask for. So thank you for your time and attention. If you want to talk more about certification